My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sangharan, Guru Piran, fellow Nyanis. On Saturday, the last satsang, I commenced Mahan's second principle, which is on thought. And I'm going to continue with where I left off the last time. I had a few questions that I put up and we discussed those questions. But today I'm going to go a little bit more deeper to really understand. The last satsang we spoke about thought. What is thought and how thoughts are generated and so on. And this is really important because thoughts are a measure of experience. And we see that sometimes we are able to control our thoughts, and there are times that thoughts just emerge. And whatever we do, we see that thoughts are very important in our lives. And we see that the thoughts which gives us the experience of life, we sometimes, are able to nurture beautiful thoughts, but there are sometimes we experience thoughts that are challenging. And we want to understand this process of this generation, sustenance, and dissolution of thoughts. And we want to know who is the creator of these thoughts. Where does it happen? How does it happen? Can we master this thought processes? Can we master the creation of thoughts? So this is what we want to understand. Because what we think is what we become. If we generate a lot of positive, universal, inspirational and blissful thoughts, you see that our lives, our perspective of life is very different. Similarly, if we have very challenging, very constricted, we have all kinds of negative thoughts, we see that our life too plays out in that way. So we see that thoughts are very important. And similarly, you see that great saints and sages, great masters have a very universal, very expansive thought, but yet very calm, cool. How is it that they're able to do this? So we want to understand, why are there differences? Why is our life experiences very different? What is the cause of this? And we'll see that a lot of it is stemmed from our thought processes, and how we see the world. So, and this is really crucial, because if you see all the, whether mindfulness or meditation or yoga practices or, self-realization process, all of this is actually about the mind and how the mind generates the thoughts or no thoughts. So it's really important to understand the generator of the thoughts, the creator of the thoughts, the architect of the thoughts. And if we understand that, then we see that we are able to, this mystery of the mind becomes a mastery. We become a master of the mind. And when we master the mind and the thought process, that which generates thoughts, you see that life completely changes. So we had these questions we spoke about. What are thoughts? What is a thought? What are thoughts? How thoughts are generated, and how they impact, what are the implications. And today I want to go a little bit more deeper, because this is the essence of Mahan's principle on the thoughts, because he talks about a universal thought and this big I and so on. So we need to understand what is this who generates the thoughts, how the thoughts are generated. The process is rather complex. Our brain itself is a very complex organ. It is, and we see that simply break it down into this complexity into 4 important components. The first one is our sensory faculties, our 5 sensory faculties, which takes information from the external world into our, information is converted into electrical pulse that is carried through our neurotransmitters, and then there's an exchange of, that electrical pulse into, a measure of experience that is picked up by the mind. And we see that, so the mind is really important to be able to, convert those, the signals into a measure of experience. And that is what we call a thought, you see. And we see that the mind then has another important faculty called the intellect. The intellect essentially is that which, we pick up a lot of, rules and engagement and conditioning that essentially tries to understand these experiences of thought, tries to make sense of it, and then tries to illumine the mind in terms of what it's seeing. If you are seeing a particular color, and if it's red color, it registers down, this is what red is, and it's able to see the next time it sees the same color, it recognizes the color, that is what I saw, and that's stored in our memory banks. So we see that we have a sensory faculty, we have we have a mind, we have an intellect, and we have a memory. So I'm going to make it very simple. Of course, the process, a more detailed process, is very complex, but I'm going to show you with this four. If you understand this, then you'd understand how thoughts are generated. So these four important components are critical for us to understand, and you'll see why mindfulness and meditation is very important. So we see that, so the process that goes through is quite interesting. We have a sensory faculty, to the mind. So sensory faculty sends information to the mind. So we have, it channels information to the mind, thoughts are generated. So we see that, there is a direct link between sensory faculties that picks up that information to the mind, and we get thoughts that gives us a measure of experience. And what's really important is that those thoughts then are analyzed by intellect. So part of the intellect is essentially to make sense and create meaning. It tries to make sense and create meaning to what these thoughts are, if it's hot, cold, all those experiences that one gets. And we see that, and once that's reasoned, the analysis of the thoughts by the intellect are then, okay, this is what cold is, and this is what hot is. So the mind then is illumined, okay, these are the experiences that I'm experiencing. And we see that there is that two-way link between the intellect and mind. There's always that, the rationalization that is taking place, the reasoning that is taking place. So we see that, there is an important link between, the sensory perception faculties to the mind. It generates thoughts. The thoughts are then analyzed by our intellect. So nature has given us the ability to learn, relearn, unlearn, all those processes that takes place in our intellect. Some of it is we learn from the conditioning, through the various things that are taught to us, and we learn ourselves. And there are some things within the intellect that is embedded. So there is a lot of, so we see that when we start learning tools of analysis, making inferences and all that, that is a core part of intellect, that learning to be able to understand all the information and the thoughts, and then illumining back the mind. This is what the relationships are. This is what this thought means. And this is something that we should be doing. We should not be doing, and then if it's cold, this is what cold means. So there is a rational component within us that reasons. And you see that is an important component even in the process of mindfulness. So we see that when that happens, we see that the experience that the mind experiences, if it is something very deep and very memorable, it's stored in the memory. And if it's something that is really not very profound or significant, it's for a short moment it's there, and then for a short, it goes into a short-term memory, and after that you probably will, it dissipates. But the ones that are most profound or deep tends to be stored in our memory. So for example, if I say, well, we know we ate about a week ago, but if I ask you, what did you eat? You probably would have to think really hard, what did you eat? But there may be events that took place when you're very young, which is very profound, that it is continuously reverberating in your mind. So we see that there are, both good thoughts that are very deep, that are, sitting in the memory, that is channeled to your memory. And there are also sometimes challenging thoughts that are also in that memory. And we also see that another important part is that, and those are memories that are stored that so that, how nature has given us it so that we can learn. And when we need that information, the information could be retrieved, somewhat like a library. So again, the memory part is so important. Like a library, you need to learn to sort. So we learn many things to help us sort our information properly. And this is where we see that the intellect is also very important. So sometimes when we learn, for example, we cannot remember timetables. I remember I had difficulty trying to remember the 12 times table, far less the 13 to 16 times table. And you start doing certain things to store it in your memory. You repeat it so many times, you memorize it and all those things. So again, we see that the memory, one is that we nurture that memory through the experiences that we have, the deep experiences, the deep thoughts that builds our memory. We also see that the intellect, we learn to sort our information in our mind very, very carefully. So if you're doing things consistently, it is, in a systematic way, we see that the memory then will, store that information systematically and consistently. Uh, so we see that very important part where both the mind and intellect plays an important role in that memory part. And and again, we see that, as I mentioned, the intellect too sends information to the memory to be stored. It also teaches the memory. So sometimes many of us learn to, memorize, learn to think deeply, reflect, introspect, contemplate, reflect, and even meditation is a process of helping both the intellect to analyze the information, to give a much more richer experience to the mind, and to store that information in the memory so that you remember things. And you see that, these three interplay between the senses, the mind, the intellect are really complex, but I'm showing in a very simplified way how this operates. So, and you see that the intellect component is really important because this is where this jnana part is critical. So one is that sharpness is very important. The focus is very important. And that's why Swamiji always say, oh, true, noka, noka. That means that intensity in what we observe, that sensory, when it brings in that information, the mind needs to be really focused in channeling things to the intellect to be able to analyze, reason, and then once the reasoning is known, the mind then is aware of these thoughts. If it's something profound, deep, it stores that information for later use. And so we see that interplay is really crucial. So let's come back to a mind. So we know this, and an ordinary mind, suppose if the intellect is weak, we don't have the tools to analyze the thoughts. We may have some knowledge, but if there are really complex thoughts and we have not learned how to do this, the mind will think, what is this, I don't understand this. I don't know why this is happening to me, and so it has that inability to rationalize or make sense. And this is where the mind starts grappling with things. What do I do? There is this, you're caught between not sure how to make that decision. But in the earlier part, when the intellect is very sharp, it informs the mind. The mind says, okay, I understand this really well. From previous experience, this is what it is, and this is how we're going to make the decision. But when the mind does not, when the intellect is very weak and on a very weak foundation, whatever information that is channeled, it is unable to understand and comprehend. The tools are not there to make sense. And so sometimes the mind becomes, makes a decision that is not well thought of. For example, sometimes something happens and people get, anger comes in. And and there is a disconnect between the anger, the thought of anger, and the rational thought of why am I getting angry? Let me calm down. You see that sometimes, all rationality goes, you decouple from the intellect that it provides that rationality, people react, and sometimes the outcomes could be quite devastating or, more difficult. So we see that if the intellect is weak, it is unable to understand or make sense, and sometimes our decisions may not be a decision that is desirable, or the outcomes may not be the outcomes that we want. The same thing we see that sometimes when we have that intellect that is weak, we don't store that information in a systematic way. So, it becomes a library that is all over. And when we want that information, we are unable to access that information. So the information is not fully stored, fully analyzed, partial information. And we see that our memory also is not, the information is bits and pieces and we can't make sense. So whenever we can't make sense, the memory has difficulty in storing. Where do I put this information? Where do I cluster this information? You see, so we see that happens all the time. And so we see that overall, we make decisions that are not, what we want to achieve. And when we get the outcomes that we do not desire, we see that, what we desire and what the outcomes becomes completely, different. And this is where we have anxieties, we have, more challenges, we get a lot more stress and a whole range of things. And this is where we see that when the mind is stressed, it is unable to rationalize, and we start, generating more negative, thoughts, and eventually it's a spiral downwards. And we see that a lot, across, the present moment with COVID, and, there's a lot of stress. People are finding it challenging, you see, and so we see that there's disconnect between, all of the faculties. And how do we then overcome this? So the whole idea is that this process is very important, that 4 important components to sensory, how we see the world, how the mind observes and create thoughts, and how it uses that intellect. And the mind needs to recognize that sometimes I don't have the knowledge to analyze this. I don't understand this. And how do I make sense of this? And this is where I think in one of the previous satsangs, I spoke about the mind needs to be strong enough to say there are things that I know, right? And there are things that I know I don't know. So if I know that I don't know something, how do I know it? This is where you got to seek that information that is critical for you to know it. When you know it, the mind becomes more illumined, and the decisions and the experiences become more illumined. So there are things that we know we don't know. There are things that we don't know we know. There are things that are already embedded in us, but we don't know because we have not sorted that information properly in our memory. It's there somewhere, but it's all over and we can't access it. So we need to learn to organize that information that is already embedded in us. So, and if we do that, we're able to access that. So we don't know that there are things that we know. So if we are able to then tap into the intellect to organize what we know and illumine the mind, then you see that it becomes more easier. And the 4th aspect is there are things that we don't know. So there are many things that it is not there in our memory bank, and it is not there. We are seeing things, but we don't know what that is. So we see that part of that is that expanding our knowledge, to probe the unknown, to seek, things, the frontiers of knowledge, and we discover new things, and we are able to then become aware of it, and aware, the awareness leads us to how it's related to us. And eventually, ultimately, we see that what we did not know, we will know that this thing is something that we did not know, that eventually we seek to find out how to know it. So this process between intellect, mind, memory, sensory are very complex. But if you break it down to simple, tool like this, you see that it helps. So many of us were in this stage or in this stage. So what do we do? So how do we then nurture an inspirational or infinite possibility mind that is, that awesome experience, no matter what the circumstances? How do we get a more universal and a blissful, or what I call a moksha mindset? And how does Mahan's teachings teaches us that? And I remember covering something called the spiritual compass some time back. And this spiritual compass is really critical. And this is what Swamiji's teachings are about. If you see the spiritual compass, most compass will have north, south, east, west. And the compass provides us a guide. So if we are lost, we can use the compass to find our way. In that same way, all of us have a spiritual compass. We all have a purpose and meaning. We all have a direction. That's the inner current in us that gives us direction. But for us to know this, we need to then understand what the spiritual compass is. So in the spiritual compass, I spoke about this. There's three important things. One is this concept of God. Somebody must have created this entire universe. It must be from something. And how did it emerge? Whatever we want to call that, universal personality or divinity, or people call it God in different forms and so on. But whatever it is, let's not worry about semantics. Say there is some universal reality called God. And there are various religions and scriptures that talk about how to attain that God, or how to get the grace of God. So many religions speak about, God, and ourselves are very different. So we have this concept of God, and I'll come back to that. The second important concept is about the universe around us, this material universe. And the third one is actually the self. Self is the being itself. So a lot of the religious teachings teach about God. This God and us are different. The purpose of religion is to enable us to get the grace of God and ultimately converge to become, experience that God realization state. So there is a whole range of rituals that are done. Many different religions have different rituals. And basically it is about discipline. It's about bhakti. It's about discipline. Through discipline, our mind becomes more pristine and calmer. In that calming mind, we have, what we call the optional thought. We have so many thoughts. So at least now we have a one thought of God that anchors everything. And ultimately from that multiple thoughts, we lead to that one thought. And that one thought gives us the grace of understanding God in its entirety, including, the divinity reverberating in us. So we have a lot of religions speak about this, bhakti or faith. And then you have so this is the Dvaita teachings, the dualism ultimately leading to that convergence. The second aspect is the Advaita teachings, is that, everything is that one reality. What we see as separation is actually an illusion because of the mind is not illumined. The whole purpose of that self is essentially about a spiritual pursuit of understanding the self. It's an experiential, process. Part of the experience is actually trying to understand what the perception of the sensory faculties are doing, what's intellect, how the mind operates. In all these processes, it's all about who is that which gives us that consciousness or that experience. So in that process, again, we see that what we see, or the changes and all those things, those experiences are all part of that one reality. When we see differences, it is what, the Advaitic people say it's illusion. Everything is that one reality. So again, it's the whole process of introspection and meditation and silencing that mind, silencing the mind with all these dynamic thoughts that are materially enveloping and folding it back into that one reality called the meditational process, or the process of yoga, to be in union with. And part of that is Mahan's teachings of the Kundalini meditation. Here it is, the part that is really important is that whether we take a religious bhakti approach or whether we take a spiritual journey, self-realization approach, we ought to take it without a dogmatic kind of a perspective. Dogmatic means taking it for granted or without questioning and without reasoning. And in Mahan's teachings, he says that whatever route you take, one needs to pursue what he calls a truth. Truth means non-changing, a rational pursuit, asking why is this happening? How is this happening? Under what condition is this happening? And there must be a logic behind this. Even that meditational experience, you get a blissful experience, there's a physiology behind that. Why do you get a blissful feeling? And and similarly, when you have that kind of a connected feeling, one needs to be able to explain what that connectedness. It's not a mystery. It's a mastery because you have a rational understanding of why this is happening. How the body, which is limited, within the body, there is components that are neither matter nor energy. And this is what we are speaking about, the mind, which is neither matter nor energy. We call it supra matter, supra energy. So the rational pursuit will lead you to that state. And similarly, one would use a scientific approach. Again, on the parallel, say it's about evidence-based, it's about empirical evidence. I am experiencing something here, whether it's spiritual or mystic, but there is a real experience. And who is the experiencer? What is the experiencer? If I do not have a brain, would I experience this? What happens in deep sleep? What happens in deep meditation? Everything is absent. Is that an experience? So we see that it's not about somebody said, this is what God is, or somebody said, this is what the experience is. These are all secondhand information. But what Mahan and many great masters teach us is that to experience this material world, everything is within us. To experience that inner cosmos is also everything within us. So it has to start with us. And within us, there is that spiritual compass. And that spiritual compass needs to be imprinted with that critical, reasoning, with a lot of reason, logic, and with scientific evidence. If I did this, what would my experience? If I change my perspective, what would the experience be? Doing a lot of sensitivity analysis. And this is what the true Doka or the intensity is, that by doing this, what is the experience of my thought? Does my thought change? As my thoughts change, do the chemistry and DNA of my mind change? When my mind changes, so the intellect is reasoning this. The intellect becomes the spiritual compass that guides the mind in terms of you generating all these thoughts. These are the experience. If I tweak it, what does this experience mean? What are you really experiencing? Is it real? So this is where, and it is not about secondary information. It is about this experience. I remember when I was first learning to practice Mahan's meditation, the vibration was very intensive in the third eye and the crest eye. Being a scientist myself, I said, this is really crazy. I'm feeling this experience. What is the logic? There's no rational, so what is it that is giving me this experience? I read it in the book, Mahan spoke about it. I got the initiation. I was skeptical, but when I experienced it, I said, hey, something is happening in me, but it's beyond my logic at that time. So the intellect was unable to understand what was happening. I was experiencing it. It could not explain what that experience is. Like the mind is experiencing something and the intellect is not ready or is not able to understand this. And this is the part that we say, what is this? This is mysticism. This is like really so. But when you pursue, so when the intellect said, no, I'm not going to take this for granted. I'm going to really probe what is happening to me when I practice this, right? And this is where that spiritual compass is so important. It starts rationalizing, okay, when I don't practice it, this is how my mind is. When I practice it, I'm getting this experience. I become more calmer. I'm actually feeling electromagnetic field in parts of my body and my mind, my brain. I can feel it. So what is happening? And this is when the pursuit of trying to find out what happens when I practice meditation, when all the thoughts become quiet. Then I realized something very interesting. I mean, being a scientist, I started probing what happens to the brain, what happens to all my neural connectivity. Something very profound starts happening. When the mind is relieved from all the thoughts, it's spending a lot of energy trying to analyze it, right? Every thought you are spending, your brain is utilizing the energy. But when the mind becomes very quiet, all the energy now is focused. You'll see some examples I'll show. It becomes like an electron microscope that focuses that energy into one place. And when a thought appears, that full concentration, the Utru Noka Noka will pierce through that thought and have a full understanding of the thought, including the thought generating process. So we see that happens in that deep meditational state. I say, this is something really interesting. So when I started probing, this is what we call mindfulness, the whole sense of scientific literature that is there. So we see something very interesting that, the mind, this spiritual compass that Mahan has shown of this, that meditational, intensity through the three stages of initiation, and that I got philosophy of staying focused and using rational pursuit and a scientific pursuit to not leave no stones unturned. Every thought is probed. So I show you this electron microscope, how it's so precise that nothing is left behind. Everything is fully analyzed, including when the moment every thought is analyzed, how the thought emerges, how it sustains, and how it's dissolved. There's a nice quote which I'll discuss in the next class. Mahan said, "Neneve neritti," he said how to stop the thought, how to analyze the thoughts, how to make sense of the thoughts, how to be enlightened by the thoughts. So somewhat, I remember when that quote, that Mahan's quote, immediately the electron microscope, when I was in the lab, I said, this is exactly what the electron microscope was doing. Any particle, anything is with a very precise sharpness, you can understand it. So what was happening was that this meditational process that Swamiji talked about earlier, so there is something very interesting that happens that, earlier I spoke about if I go back to this chart here, intellect, mind, the part where the intellect is very weak, unable to understand, you see that this spiritual compass with the electron microscope well, now the intellect plays like the electron microscope. And this is where you see that Mahan's first initiation of awakening, that is very important. So what happens here is, this is the process that happens. So when the mind absorbs this meditational introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, the intellect takes on the role like a spiritual compass. It's focused, it knows its direction. And when the sensory perception sends that information to the mind then says, look, before I do anything, let me introspect, contemplate, reflect, meditate, send it to this intellect. Let's analyze why this is here, how this is here. The intellect then starts saying, okay, let's break it down to bits and bytes. Why is this happening? I'm feeling this. Let's see what is causing this. And when the intellect is able to think through, of course, the intellect needs, various knowledge, the knowledge of analysis, the knowledge of inferences, the knowledge of gathering information, the knowledge of experiences, all that. And the intellect says, okay, this is what it is, this is why you're experiencing this. So the mind now becomes more illumined, more enlightened. If the intellect is weak, we see that it is unable to provide the mind the adequate information to be enlightened. And this is the part. So what we are doing in all the satsang is actually to transform an important part of the mind, which is intellect, to become more sharper, more attuned to one's own inner vibration, to be able to understand what all these thoughts and experiences are. So we see that any thought that emerges is then channeled to the intellect, and the intellect illumines the mind, and things that the intellect really understood will then be channeled back to the memory. Experiences of the mind that is really inspiring and fully understood channel back to the memory. And you see that the feedback between the intellect and the mind and the strengthening of that strengthens our memory. And this is why you see that people like Mahan and all can remember every detail, because the experience has been profound. So this is the important experience. So we see that whole in the early stages, say, I'm experiencing this. The mind, as information is coming from outside, but mind is experiencing something. I don't know what that is. Let me analyze this. If I don't know, let me find out how to know it. Where am I going to get that information? Who is going to show me this? How do I introspect, contemplate, reflect, and meditate? And then you become illumined. And the mind says, I understand this thought really well. It's, now even though it's a challenging experience, it's a foundation for new learning. You see that what was a scar becomes a star. So this process takes place over and over again, and our memory becomes really deep and expansive. And what is really interesting is that the strong linkages between that intellect, the mind, and the memory becomes sealed, seamlessly integrated, right? There's no more arrows. It's just a continuous confluence of, and as a matter of fact, when it is so sealed up, sometimes the mind is able to get inspirations that informs the intellect, hey, this is how we can try this thing, and it stores in the memory. And what is really interesting is that strong linkages, intellect itself is no more the spiritual compass. The three component itself becomes an important seamless spiritual compass. And this is where we start seeing that blissful. Sometimes we are not experiencing anything. The eyes, everything is closed, but we get that beautiful, blissful experience. And sometimes there are things that are embedded in our memory by nature starts opening up, and the mind becomes aware of it. The intellect becomes aware of it. You get new inspirations. And that seamless integration is what we call that spiritual compass that gives us that inspirational, infinite possibilities that is embedded in all of us. That's what gives us that awesome, universal, blissful experience. So, and it becomes a continuous flow. It's completely sealed. It's like a highway. Before you have small roads, between that you've got bridges, but now you have a sealed highway. What do I mean by the sealed highway? It's actually our neural pathways become more deeper and more wider, and the bandwidth becomes so strong that there's a seamless integration between the mind, intellect, and the memory. And sometimes we get that is in itself as an integrated spiritual compass. And you can see that in your own mindset. You can also see that in your own behavior. You can also see that in the way you see the world. And you get something as a very important word that they use called tejas. Go and Google what that tejas is. That blissful, glowing mindset, and you get something called ojas. Ojas is actually that glow around you, and this is what that overall spiritual compass that Swamiji talks about. So we see this over many years of practicing that meditation. You have that seamless integration of that, that gives you that inspirational, awesome, universal, blissful experience. So the next part is that that's still at the mind level, but the sensory perception is coming through. But the next part is that how do we take it through across our lives? Sometimes you have that great blissful experience. And this is the part that Mahan's teaching is so important. He says, don't run away from your responsibilities. You'd probably hear many people say that, desires should get rid of desires, all that, only then you attain enlightenment. Here, faculty, we are part and parcel of this material world, and nature's embedded that, continuous flow of information that gives us experiences and, ambition and aspiration and desires. So somebody doesn't say, no, desires are not important, or you should leave all the desires. No, he says, build that spiritual compass. But the next phase is really important. He said, how do you permeate the divine thoughts in all aspects of your life? That means not just that blissful feeling, nice feeling. We all have to come back and interact in this material world, right? So we can't say this is an illusion, right? And completely quit and do other things. No, somebody says it's all a confluence of one. So one needs to be able to, experience the divinity, and if it's one, then you can percolate it and permeate it in every facet of our lives. And how do we take it and see that full potential of the universal divinity in everything that we do? And this is the part that is really important. He says that when we have that confluence of that mindset, then what was coming from outside to inside, and we are rationalizing, then what we need to do is that mindset now, which is universal and inspirational, will influence our perception of the world. It'll transform how we see the world. It'll transform how we cognize the things around us. It'll transform our own decision-making process and ultimately our own actions and the reactions and the interplay now between the mind, intellect, and our memory now percolates into our sensory perception, and the sensory perception becomes one with the other three components. And this is the part that is really important, is that when the intellect, mind, what I call the spiritual compass, percolates into the sensory faculties, we see that what we see becomes enlightened. We may have missed many things before when the mind is in not well synced. But when the mind is in that universal dimension, what we see is from a universal perspective. Our sight becomes really enlightened. Many things, subtle things we missed out, our eyes is able to pick it up. Things that we missed out listening, we miss out a lot of subtle things, including the subtle vibration and resonation in us. We can experience it, not just in meditation, but in every facet of our lives. We're fully connected. The smell, the sense of smell, the fragrance of life becomes so clear. The sense of taste, the awesome beauty of taste that we get, the flavorful things that we get. Even, sometimes when we eat very simple food, a simple, I'm not sure many of you all probably would have eaten this, 1 day old rice. You pour some water, some salt, or a little bit of tairu, and you, break some chili and you eat it. A simple food, your senses become so awakened that the most simplest food would taste the most divine. It just becomes awesome tasting. And simple things become really magnified. And similarly, in the sense of, we get an enlightened sense of touch. Whatever we experience becomes more profound and more universal. So we see that a spiritual compass which navigates us, now navigates the sensory perception from a very limitedness to becoming more and more universal and more profound and more enlightened. So what we missed, we start picking up very subtle things. Even sometimes when you see certain people, you can actually pick up the subtleties that they may not pick up, you can pick it up. And this is the part that is important. So when our sensory perception starts, transforming, our actions also starts changing. You see that we see the world differently, we hear differently. Sometimes, things may be very challenging, but you see, positivities, you see, inspiration, you see opportunities, and you see that our actions also become inspirational, universal, and blissful. even in the most difficult circumstances. So we see that the interconnectivity, it becomes seamlessly integrated. The spiritual compass now seamlessly integrates with our sensory perception, how we see the world, and also our action, our decision-making process, and also our actions. So ultimately, we see that, our mind, intellect, memory, sensory faculties, our actions all work in unison, vibrating at the same frequency, the universal rhythm. That unarvu, that Swamiji says, unarvu gavanipa, this is what he's saying, is that he's telling, bring your mind to this spiritual compass level, that everything resonates. And you see that whatever decisions that you take becomes profound. That is why he says that whatever happens is for the greater good. Whatever is going to happen is also for the greater good, if you cultivate and nurture a spiritual mind. So what are the, so here is where we bring everything together in that regular, continuous meditational process of this consistency. And ultimately, what is the impact on our lives? We should be able to see the impact, right? And this is the part that is really important, that I can, many people say, well, you have to run away to the jungle or give up your desires. Not really. If you have this mindset, everything that you do becomes, so rich and universal, and I'll speak about what that is. That mindset leads to the core, what we call the spiritual capital. This mindset leads to the spiritual capital that is embedded, nature's embedded in us. You see, and this seamlessly integrated spiritual compass that we have, is able to unlock that spiritual capital in us. And what is that spiritual capital? The abundance of infinite possibilities and, potentialities. And what does that lead to? It leads us to a few important things. The first one is actually our mind becomes powerful. Our mind, which consists of, the reasoning component, the memory, the process of generating the thoughts, all becomes an integrated spiritual compass. And that's what our spiritual universal reality is. What is the things that you will experience? Emotional capital. You'll be able to manage all your emotions. You would have not up and down. It's that samatva, equanimity, the ability to say, okay, something great has happened, something positive has happened. I should not get my ego up. I would, we learn to accept things with a lot of grace and humility, but also when difficulty comes, not to crumble, but okay, is there something I need to learn? How do I, use the stealth of our mind to be able to address this and transform these challenges into opportunities for learning, the pressures into treasures for enlightenment. And both the sukhas and the dukkhas are then used as a combustion for enlightenment. So we see that we're always in the state of balance, samatva. When we do that, you see that automatically our physical capital becomes strong. Our body becomes strong. We know what we need to do, right? The mind is strong. Okay, we need to eat healthily. We need to do this. We need to have good, get rid of all the toxic relationships, blaming other people and do, no. If they don't want to do it, it's okay. You take it on. And if it's really important, take it on and do it, right? So we see that our body becomes healthy. We take the time to rest. We take the time to have good sleep, exercise, eat well, and we see that our physical capital improves. So when our emotional capital and our physical capital improves, we see that our intellectual capital, I talked about the intellect becomes more sharper and deeper. The intellect becomes more stronger. It searches for the truth. When we get that intellectual capital, the ability to analyze, the ability to synthesize, the ability to put it together, the ability to capture information, the ability to then make sense of it and illumine the mind. And we see that when we build that intellectual capital, we see that something very interesting happens in all of us. Nature has not given all of us everything. but nature has given us something, and part of the something is our creativity. So when we have the right intellectual capital and be able to analyze things, the creativity in us comes out, whether it's in cooking or music or doing mathematics or being able to analyze things. We all are creative beings. The mere fact that we are all here means that we were very successful in running the race to fertilize the egg. So we must be creative. We must have done something to be here. So that creative potential is embedded in our memory. And many of us don't know how to unlock it. And the earlier mindset I spoke about will enable you to unlock that creativity from, within all of us. And when we unlock the creativity, we acquire what we call the natural capital. Nature is core to us. And part of nature has that powerful capital and what we call natural capital. Whether playing music, writing poetry, being a writer, whatever it is embedded in us. As I mentioned, nature has not given all of us all the things, but it's given us something. And that something is for us to discover, not somebody else. And that introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation enables us to unlock that natural capital. Now, when we acquire that capital, we see that, something very interesting. We don't feel inferior or superior. We're able to relate to everybody because the mindset now is universal. We're able to relate to a child, we're able to relate to a scientist, leaders of the country, people of different strata. We're able to build that, this human, the interaction, the ability to talk to anyone, learn from anyone. That's social capital. We are social beings. And there's a capital that we learn from one another. I mean, I learn a lot from my students. I learn a lot from my disciples. I learn a lot from my gurus, from the people that walk through my life. So always attuned to learning new things, sharing new things. And you see that our social fabric of our life becomes more richer. Our relationships, with our family, our spouses, our children, our friends, we become we don't take things seriously, but we're always positive and inspirational. The next capital that this mindset gives is this empowered capital. The capital that most people don't speak about, the capital that the inner resources in us is far greater than the universe that we live in, because that inner capital is core to that spiritual capital that is the universal reality, that center of everything. And if we understand that, we will never ever say that we don't have anything. That inner resources empowers us to do. We don't have to be dependent on anyone or anything. We have things to become self-sustaining, right? No matter which circumstances, where they put you, you'll be able to generate that adequate resources to be able to sustain oneself, both spiritual, mental, intellectual, and including the physical capital. And this is what, you see that people who are enlightened will never have the defeatist mindset, giving up that mindset. Today I'm going to do this, tomorrow I'm not. It's consistency. There's no excuse. They always feel empowered to be able to self-sustain themselves. And the next capital is that when you have all this capital, you have this leadership capital, not only to lead yourself, but lead other people. And I like this word called CEO. You become the chief enlightenment officer of your life first, before you become a CEO of anything. If you are not a CEO of your life, you cannot be CEO of anything. So the leadership starts with us. Can we lead us to that path of that true reality, that universal reality, a mindset that is universal? And if we are able to do it, we're able to lead anything. And finally, we see that, if through the spiritual capital of generating each one of those capital in that sequence, final capital is that we attain that economic capital, the material capital that is adequate to sustain us. We will never be poor in this world. You see, we may not be billionaires, but we will have adequate to sustain ourselves, our families, and maybe a little bit of resources to help others who are unable to do it. And that's what this mindset is. To answer this question, what would you see? You see that gradually, over time, as you build that spiritual capital, your emotional state will improve, your physical capital will improve, your intellectual capital, you'll be curious. Wow, this is awesome. I want to learn new things. Your creativity comes, the way you do things completely starts changing. You start developing new talent, and your relationships improve with your spouses and friends and family. You feel so empowered, and finally you start leading. I've seen, I was very fortunate today that, I was with some leadership, senior citizens group, and some of them are in the 60s and 70s and older. And in spite of the COVID, they're doing so many things. They're so empowered and so fun-loving and doing many, many things that they're leading themselves and leading other people. So age is not it's something that should keep you down. When you take the spiritual approach, you see that you never age, because the spirit does not age. Time doesn't touch it. They become transcendental to it. Yes, body goes through the change, but the spirit is always, ready to, get on and to do things. And ultimately, you see that, you would not be financially or materially poor. And this is what this mindset is about, this thought process, that if you're able to create this spiritual compass in all of us, we're able to live a awesome and amazing spiritual life. Sandosham.